So you brought up the wildfires, which I really appreciate. The wildfires in California. This transitions into an issue that I know both of us have a lot of interest in. One of the things that happened in those wildfires was Verizon throttled the data ability of some of the people fighting those fires.
That's right.
Now, even if we did have net neutrality, that still could have happened, just to, cross our T's and dot our I's here.
Yep.
However, with the loss of net neutrality, there was really no accountability for it. We have lost net neutrality. We do have a good bill here in California. At least I think it was a pretty good bill that did pass. But now it's being battled out in the courts, which is why we haven't seen the effects of a post-net neutrality world yet, because a bunch of activists and organizations are holding the front lines to try to make sure we don't lose the internet as we know it, basically. So what are your thoughts on net neutrality? What are your thoughts on the concept of universal broadband? And you can go into the details as an elected official and as an individual.
I appreciate that. And I'll note here that I do work during the day in my day job for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I've been there for 5 years. At the moment, I will represent my personal views, which in places might resemble those of the organization I work for. But I am very deeply committed to net neutrality, and I am very concerned about the Trump administration's attack on the right of internet users to access the global network on the same terms as anybody else. I will say, to her credit, this is one of the places where Speaker Pelosi has shown up, and she did help usher the Save the Internet Act through the House. It now sits before the Senate. So at the same time, there's really two fronts at the moment. One is in the Senate, where even though net neutrality is a bipartisan issue and 80% of Americans across both major political parties support it, it, for better or worse, has devolved to a partisan issue on the Hill. And in the Senate, because we haven't been able to secure the support of Republican senators, the Save the Internet Act still has not been enacted into law. You're right about the efforts among states. California is one of several states that have attempted to secure net neutrality at the state level, and we're currently fighting a battle with the federal government over whether or not states have that right to give their own residents equal access to the global internet, or if instead they have to be subjected to the same federal regime that allows corporate predation by internet service providers, namely specifically AT&T, Comcast, and Verizon, who are the three bad corporate actors who have been attacking internet user rights across the country for years.
There's more than three, but they're all merging, so.
There's that. What I want to differentiate between small ISPs and the big ones. Sure. You know, there are many small ISPs here in San Francisco, like Sonic, like Monkey Brains, that are fighting for net neutrality because they want their users to be able to access the internet on the same terms as corporate behemoths. But the big ISPs, the big corporate ones, they want to use that as a revenue stream, and they frankly want to squeeze users for every cent they can get out of them. And that's where.
And there was an issue recently. You bring up small ISPs. There was an issue recently. Now, full disclaimer here, in fairness to you and everyone else, I actually have been reading about this via the EFF.
Okay.
But San Francisco very recently just kind of had a blow from the FCC, where the FCC kind of ruled in favor of Comcast and big cable because they were basically trying to squash competition in the area, where San Francisco had previously voted for more broadband diversity. And then the FCC came in and they're like, oh, well, this is the cables are, like, they basically said, oh, the cables are conflating, like the cables are being on top of one another, even though there was policy in place to prevent that from happening. So it wasn't happening. The FCC just lied and said it was, and said it was a concern. And then they squashed this.
Under the leadership of Trump's appointee, Ajit Pai, we really can't trust the FCC to do its job in a neutral way. I mean, I would say that about the entire federal government under Trump's administration, right?
Certainly.
But as long as we're talking about things that have happened here recently in San Francisco, I just want to point at another thing that our city did very recently, which was adopt the first nationwide, the first in the nation local ban on the use of face surveillance technology by government agencies, including law enforcement. And that's a campaign on which I've been working for 10 years, long preceding the recent fight in San Francisco, long preceding even the emergence of face surveillance technology. I've been fighting to limit the mass and targeted surveillance regime at the local level because Congress has been asleep at the switch. For 6 years, I led a national nonprofit called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. It's since been rebranded as Defending Rights Dissents, and I sit on the board of that organization. And it was founded, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, that is, in 2001 under the Bush administration to fight the Patriot Act. And so I've done a lot of things in that arena, from litigation in the courts to policy work in states around the country and local levels around the country, grassroots organizing at the local level, building coalitions to challenge policing abuses, not just in the context of surveillance, but also in the context of racial profiling and the drug war and the war on immigrants, stitching those communities together into stronger coalitions to then fight for broad civil rights protections that protect everyone. An example of this is the Community Safety Act, which passed in Providence, Rhode Island about 2, maybe 3 years ago. It is the strongest local civil rights law in the land, and I'm proud of having crafted several of its components. The recent ban on face surveillance here in San Francisco is the first of its kind. It's roughly the dozenth of its kind that builds on an established framework around the country that subjects local police surveillance to independent civilian oversight. And I've spoken out about that issue and written about that issue at some length for years. And I'll just say this, the reason I've been fighting at the local level is, again, because Congress has been unfortunately unhelpful in defending constitutional rights. And that's exactly why I'm running to replace Speaker Pelosi in San Francisco, because I want, for instance, to support the kind of investigation that Congress hasn't done in the last 40 years. Every time Congress has ever looked carefully, they've caught the intelligence agencies like the FBI, the DEA, the NSA, the CIA, with their hands in the constitutional cookie jar, doing things as severe as what the Senate in 1976 described as a sophisticated vigilante. This is a direct quote, a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at suppressing the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. The FBI did that for 50 years, and frankly, they never stopped. But Congress stopped doing its job of conducting oversight, and that's what I'm very eager to resuscitate.
So, and I appreciate you bringing up the facial recognition ban, and I'll give a full disclaimer myself here. An organization that did a lot of work in that regards, who I know has some cross-pollination with the EFF as well, is Fight for the Future.
Yeah, they're great.
And yeah, I recently collaborated with them. We did a campaign for net neutrality. And I was
Were you part of the protests against the TPP, the rock the TPP?
That was before my time. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
right.
I mean, I was a fan of the organization back then, but that was before.
Yeah.
They brought me in recently. I was part of the. We went to Mitch McConnell's office and presented him, and we did this alongside Demand Progress. Free Press was there.
Nice.
Hispanics for media. Yeah, a lot of great groups were there. It was really, really cool. And we went to Mitch McConnell's office. We live streamed it. And we presented him with 3.5 million petitions for net neutrality.
Nice.
Mitch McConnell was not there. He was in a shell or elsewhere. You don't have to laugh at that. but his people were there. And then they were actually, they let us present the petitions. We weren't allowed to film in his office, but they left the door open so we could basically have the camera on and have the stream on while people were in there. So, it was a cool thing, and hopefully it works out. But yeah, I know Fight for the Future has done a lot on the facial recognition ban too. Well, so you bring up acting locally, which I agree is incredibly important on this issue. One way I'm doing that in Pasadena, where I live, I'm trying to get municipal broadband here. I've looked into a little bit briefly on starting a nonprofit for the cause. Still kind of laying some groundwork there and looking into it. I don't know if it's something I'd actually be able to undertake or not, but what are your thoughts?
We can connect on other fronts then with respect to my day job, because my whole job at EFF is to support grassroots organizing at the local level. So let's follow up about that.
I would love that. Well, what are your thoughts on municipal broadband then? Because I know, you bring up there are some good ISPs.
Yeah.
The reason I've gone more the municipal broadband route is because it just seems like that's what we should have done in the first place. We need to take the internet out of big cable's hands, put it into the hands of our cities and municipalities, make sure net neutrality is in the charter, and we can do it. Look at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Look at Sandy, Oregon. And, when people try to make this argument, well, I don't know if every town in the country can afford it. Charlemont, Massachusetts has 7,000 freaking people. They're doing it.
Right.
So, yes, it can be done.
Yes, it can be done. And I would say that small ISPs can layer on municipal broadband frameworks, right? So when we talk about municipal broadband, it can look in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that can look is cities owning the fiber that they then lease out to small ISPs that, because they're using a shared infrastructure, will be forced to price the services competitively. That's the key here. The big ISPs, Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, they enjoy local monopolies, and they use those monopolies predatorily to extract economic rent from their users without delivering the same kind of service that they're entitled to. And I think it's the fact that the market is not competitive that unfortunately, predictably undermines the outcomes in so many different places. And municipal broadband is one way to address it. And the thing I want to raise out there is the public nature of the resource. We have an opportunity in our country across a great many spheres. Medicare for All is one, municipal broadband is another one at a local level, to collectively provide resources to ensure that no one has to go without. And that's one way that we get, for instance, to debt-free college opportunities is by pooling our resources. That's what a Wall Street transactions tax does, is pool our resources as a society to make sure that they're going where they will be most useful instead of where they will be more destructive. And that's what we do at the moment, is we channel your income taxes and we feed it to fraudulent military weapons contracts like fighter planes that we don't need to fight wars that they're incapable of fighting against enemies that we don't actually have. And we'll spend trillions of dollars on that while claiming that somehow we don't have the money to make housing a human right or food a human right. And I think that that's frankly preposterous. We have the money to make not just healthcare a human right, and education and access to fire services, right? But healthcare, food, shelter, these are basic human rights. We have the resources to provide them for each other if we just make those choices together. Sometimes that's described as a lack of political will. I think the political will is there, the leadership is not there. And that's why I'm running to replace the Speaker of the House in CH12.
Nice callback. Yeah, I like it. And one of the ways I like to describe what big cable's doing is that I kind of describe it, you mentioned how like they have these anti-competitive monopolies. I always describe it. They've essentially organized like an organized duopoly, kind of like the mafia, basically.
Or the corporate political parties.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. This is our territory. You stay out of here. We're going to stay out of here. And we don't have to make this any better because what choice do people have?
It's so funny you should say this. I wrote an op-ed in the wee hours of this very morning responding to a court case. The Supreme Court yesterday decided a case basically giving away the political system to partisan gerrymandering. Yeah. And my solution to that, and I've proposed this for years since I studied political process and antitrust in law school, is, and I'd like to, as a member of Congress, legislate an expansion of antitrust statutes specifically to remove the exemptions for sports leagues and subject political markets to the same competition rules that economic markets are already subjected to. Another way of putting that is that the agreements that political parties and candidates make, particularly in the context of drawing legislative districts in state legislatures, the congressional apportionment process, it effectively reflects any number of horizontal agreements among competitors that collude and undermine the rights of effectively consumers, voters. In other words, political parties and office holders do all the time what companies are prohibited from doing, which is making agreements to divide territory. That's flatly prohibited under the antitrust laws, but only companies are subjected to it, even though capturing political markets carries vastly more risk to our society. And so fixing that loophole is one I want to do. And while I'm on it, just as long as the sports leagues came up, the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, they have statutory exemptions from antitrust rules because all of those leagues, frankly, violate antitrust laws all the time. I think particularly we should not be allowing antitrust exemptions for enterprises that suppress the speech of their workers. And that's exactly what the NBA did to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. It's exactly what the NFL did to Colin Kaepernick. And we as a society should not be insulating those kinds of enterprises that undermine constitutional rights, particularly of workers. That's a labor issue and a constitutional free speech issue, as well as an antitrust issue.
So in summary, in very short summary here, you are using your law degree for not evil, which is very cool. Thanks for doing that.
I appreciate it.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and